The October fog rolled through Copper Creek Hollow like the breath of ancient spirits, thick enough to hide a man at 10 paces and dense enough to muffle the sound of approaching death. It was 1924, and the mountain pass through Devil's Canyon had earned its name through 3 decades of mysterious disappearances, unexplained accidents, and travelers who simply vanished between sunrise and sunset along the narrow road that connected Charleston to the coal camps beyond. But before we dive into the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Local folks whispered about the massive oak stump that sat like a fortress on the ridge overlooking the pass, a hollow giant that had been struck by lightning and carved by time until it resembled more monument than tree. Some claimed it was haunted by the spirits of Cherokee warriors who'd died defending their sacred hunting grounds. Others insisted it was cursed by the blood of Union soldiers who'd fallen during a forgotten Civil War skirmish. But the smart money, the kind that kept mountain families alive during hard times, knew the truth was both simpler and more dangerous than any ghost story. Ezekiel Harlan stood exactly 4 feet, 3 inches tall in his worn leather boots, but every person in 3 counties knew better than to measure a man by his height when that man controlled the most profitable stretch of road between Virginia and Ohio. At 28, little Zeke had built a reputation that stretched from the coal fields of Logan County to the speakeasies of Charleston, a reputation founded on 3 simple principles. Every traveler paid a toll, every debt was collected in full, and every challenge to his authority was answered with violence so swift and brutal that survivors carried the memory like scars. The Stump House itself was an engineering marvel that combined mountain ingenuity with strategic necessity. The lightning-struck oak had been dead for 40 years, its massive trunk hollow and weather-carved until it resembled a natural fortress, 30 feet across and 20 feet high. Zeke's father, Old Man Harlan, had been the first to recognize its potential, carving windows and reinforcing the structure until it became an impregnable command post that overlooked every approach to Devil's Canyon. Inside the hollow trunk, Zeke had created a living space that defied every assumption about mountain poverty. Persian rugs covered floors of polished hardwood, salvaged from abandoned lumber camps. Electric lights powered by a water wheel generator illuminated rooms furnished with pieces looted from the mansions of coal barons, who'd been foolish enough to travel these roads without paying proper tribute. The walls were lined with weapons collected from 20 years of highway operations, rifles, pistols, knives, and tools of intimidation that ranged from professional to improvised. But the real genius of Zeke's operation lay in its integration with the mountain community that had raised him. The Harlan family had lived in these hills for 6 generations, arriving before the Revolutionary War and surviving every economic collapse, government crackdown, and corporate invasion that had threatened traditional mountain life. Zeke's highway tolls weren't simple theft. They were a form of taxation that funded an entire underground economy built on mutual protection and shared defiance of outside authority. The morning of October 15th, 1924, brought news that would test everything Zeke had built over 8 years of careful expansion. Tommy Morrison, one of his lookouts positioned along the main road, came scrambling up the hidden trail to the Stump House with intelligence that made Zeke's blood run cold despite the autumn warmth. "Zeke!" Tommy gasped, his 19-year-old lungs working hard from the climb. "You got trouble coming. Big trouble. Federal agents in Charleston been asking questions about missing travelers, about toll operations in the mountains, about you specifically." Zeke stood at one of the carved windows, studying the road below through binoculars that had belonged to his grandfather's Confederate unit. At 4 feet 3, his compact frame was perfectly proportioned, his strength concentrated into a build that could move through mountain terrain like smoke through trees. The dwarfism that made him distinctive had never made him weak. Generations of Harlan men had learned to use every advantage that mountain living could provide, and physical differences became tactical assets in the hands of people who understood how to fight smart rather than fair. "What kind of questions?" Zeke asked, his voice carrying the particular calm that mountain people recognized as a warning sign. Tommy consulted notes scrawled on a piece of paper torn from a Charleston newspaper. "Questions about travelers who never reached their destinations, about highway robberies that local law don't seem to solve, about a small man with a big reputation who operates out of some kind of fortress in Devil's Canyon." The intelligence confirmed Zeke's worst fears about what had been building for months. The federal government was finally taking notice of activities that local authorities had chosen to ignore, either through corruption, fear, or understanding that mountain justice operated according to rules that Washington bureaucrats would never comprehend. Zeke had built his operation carefully, targeting travelers who could afford to lose money without destroying their lives, while protecting local families who needed safe passage through territories controlled by coal companies and corporate enforcers. His tolls were fair, his protection was real, and his justice was swift. But federal agents wouldn't understand the difference between highway robbery and community defense, between criminal activity and mountain tradition. "Tommy," Zeke said quietly, "how long before these federal boys make it up here?" Tommy's answer carried the weight of intelligence that would determine whether Zeke's operation survived or died within the next few days. "Word is they're planning a raid within the week. Maybe sooner if they think you're getting suspicious about their interest." But ayo? Zeke felt the familiar sensation that had sustained him through 8 years of highway operations. The cold clarity that came from accepting that conflict was inevitable and focusing on tactical preparation that would ensure survival. The federal government represented a different kind of enemy than the coal company enforcers, corrupt sheriffs, and urban gangsters who'd challenged his authority over the years. Federal agents had resources, training, and legal authority that made them more dangerous than any opponent he'd faced. But Zeke also possessed advantages that federal training couldn't provide. He knew every trail, every hiding place, and every tactical position within a 20-mile radius of Devil's Canyon. He had the support of mountain communities that had learned to trust his protection more than government promises. And he understood that some traditions were worth defending through whatever methods were necessary to preserve them. The Stump House had been designed for exactly this kind of siege. Its position on the ridge provided perfect observation of all approach routes while offering multiple escape paths through mountain terrain that would be impossible for federal agents to navigate without local knowledge. The structure itself was virtually impregnable to assault by conventional forces, and Zeke had spent years preparing supply caches and defensive positions that could sustain extended operations. But defense alone wouldn't be sufficient against federal determination, backed by unlimited resources and legal authority. Zeke's survival would depend on convincing the government that controlling Devil's Canyon carried costs that exceeded any benefits federal agents might gain from destroying his operation. As Tommy prepared to return to his surveillance position, Zeke made the decision that would determine everything that followed. "Tommy, send word to all our people. Tell them it's time to find out whether mountain justice can still protect mountain families when the federal government decides to impose its authority on communities that never asked for its protection." The young man nodded and disappeared down the hidden trail, leaving Zeke alone in his fortress to contemplate the approaching storm. Through his binoculars, he could see the road where hundreds of travelers had learned to respect mountain traditions and pay tribute to local authority. Soon, that same road would carry federal agents who believed their badges granted them automatic victory over any opposition. Zeke's radio crackled with reports from his network of lookouts, informants, and sympathizers throughout 3 counties. The federal investigation was more extensive than Tommy's initial intelligence had suggested. Agents were interviewing victims of highway robberies, examining county records for unexplained disappearances, and building cases that would justify military-scale operations against mountain communities that had operated independently for generations. But the radio also carried intelligence that federal agents couldn't access through their official channels. Local families were reporting increased government surveillance, unusual questions from outsiders claiming to conduct surveys or business research, and the kind of systematic information gathering that preceded major federal enforcement operations. The mountain communication network that had protected communities since the Civil War was mobilizing to defend traditions that predated federal authority. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across Devil's Canyon, Zeke understood that the conflict approaching his fortress would determine more than his personal survival. The federal raid on his operation would test whether mountain communities could still defend themselves against government authority, whether traditional justice could compete with federal law, and whether small men with big reputations could survive in a world increasingly dominated by bureaucratic power and institutional control. The tree that had sheltered the Harlan family for 2 generations was about to become the focal point of a war between federal authority and mountain independence, between government law and community tradition, between officials who believed badges granted them unlimited power and mountain people who had never accepted that some authorities were too powerful to resist. Zeke checked his weapons, reviewed his defensive plans, and prepared to demonstrate that some fortresses were too strong to be taken by conventional force. Some traditions were too valuable to be abandoned without a fight, and some men were too dangerous to be underestimated regardless of their physical stature. The federal government was about to learn why smart people had avoided Devil's Canyon for 30 years and why the tree that swallowed men whole had earned its reputation through methods that no government manual had ever taught agents to counter. The mountain was preparing for war, and little Zeke Harlan was ready to remind Washington that some parts of America had never truly been conquered by federal authority, never accepted that government law superseded community justice, and never forgotten that survival sometimes required violence that civilized people preferred not to understand. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through Appalachian folklore for generations. But first, Zeke had to survive the initial federal assault on a fortress that had never fallen to any enemy, protected by traditions that had never bowed to any outside authority, and defended by a man whose size had never determined his willingness to fight against impossible odds. The fog continued to roll through Copper Creek Hollow as darkness approached, but it would soon carry more than mountain moisture. It would carry the smoke of battle between federal agents who believed in the power of their badges and a mountain outlaw who understood that some reputations were built on principles that no government could legislate away. The Charleston Federal Building buzzed with the kind of controlled urgency that preceded major operations, its marble corridors echoing with the footsteps of agents who believed they were about to write the final chapter in Appalachian lawlessness. Special Agent Robert Big Bob Kellerman stood 6 feet 4 inches in his government-issued boots, weighing 240 pounds of federal authority and metropolitan confidence. At 35, he'd built his reputation by dismantling bootlegging operations from Kentucky to Pennsylvania, and he viewed the Ezekiel Harlan case as an opportunity to demonstrate that no outlaw, regardless of local support or terrain advantage, could resist the full power of federal enforcement. Kellerman's briefing room was filled with detailed maps, photographs, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of criminal enterprise more sophisticated than anything his superiors in Washington had expected to find in the West Virginia mountains. The Harlan operation wasn't simply highway robbery. It was an integrated system of taxation, protection, and territorial control that had operated independently of federal authority for nearly a decade. "Gentlemen," Kellerman announced to his team of 12 agents, "Ezekiel Harlan represents everything that's wrong with allowing rural communities to operate outside federal oversight. This individual has turned a mountain pass into his personal kingdom, collecting illegal tolls from interstate travelers and eliminating anyone who challenges his authority." Agent Perry Williams, Kellerman's second-in-command, studied aerial photographs of Devil's Canyon that revealed the strategic genius of Zeke's position. The Stump House commanded perfect observation of the entire pass while remaining virtually invisible from the road below. Any assault would require federal agents to climb exposed terrain under direct observation by defenders who knew every rock, tree, and hiding place within miles. "Sir," Williams observed, "this isn't going to be a simple arrest operation. Harlan's position is essentially unassailable by conventional means, and intelligence suggests he has extensive community support that could complicate our mission." Kellerman's response revealed the fundamental arrogance that had brought him into conflict with opponents he'd never understood. "Agent Williams, this individual is a criminal dwarf, hiding in a tree stump. I don't care how many hillbillies think he's some kind of folk hero. Federal authority doesn't negotiate with highway robbers, regardless of their local popularity." But Kellerman's intelligence files didn't contain the information that would prove crucial to understanding what his team was actually facing. The reports described Zeke's physical stature, his criminal activities, and his tactical position, but they failed to capture the cultural significance of what the Harlan operation represented to mountain communities that had been fighting government intrusion for over a century. 300 miles from Charleston, in a hollow so remote that federal maps showed it as unnamed wilderness, the mountain communication network was mobilizing resources that would have impressed military strategists, but were simply normal community defense for families who'd learned that survival required cooperation against outside threats. Dale Morrison, a grizzled veteran of both world wars, coordinated intelligence gathering that reached from coal camps to county courthouses, creating a real-time picture of federal preparations that exceeded anything Kellerman's official channels could provide. Zeke, Dale's voice crackled over the radio network that connected mountain families throughout 3 counties. Federal boys are planning a dawn assault with 12 agents, military-style equipment, and enough firepower to level half the ridge. But they're thinking like city folk who believe superior numbers guarantee victory. Zeke received this intelligence while standing in the main room of his stump house, surrounded by weapons and supplies that represented 8 years of careful preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. But his real advantage wasn't firepower. It was understanding how federal agents thought, how they planned operations, and where their training created predictable weaknesses that mountain warfare could exploit. Dale, Zeke replied, "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" 48 hours, maybe less. They're staging at the federal building tonight, planning to move before sunrise to catch you sleeping. Standard federal doctrine for rural operations. Zeke smiled grimly, understanding that Kellerman's team was about to receive an education in mountain warfare that no government training had prepared them to handle. Federal agents expected to face criminals who would either surrender when confronted by superior authority or flee when overwhelmed by superior numbers. They weren't prepared for opponents who viewed federal intrusion as a declaration of war against community traditions that had been defended for generations. The next 36 hours transformed Devil's Canyon into a fortress that combined mountain ingenuity with tactical sophistication. Zeke's network of supporters began implementing defensive preparations that had been planned for years but never fully activated. Every approach to the Stump House was fortified with obstacles that appeared natural but would channel federal agents into predetermined killing zones. Every escape route was prepared with supplies, weapons, and communication equipment that would allow sustained resistance even if the main fortress fell. But the most important preparations were psychological. Mountain communities had learned during the mine wars that federal agents could be defeated, not just through superior firepower, but through creating situations where their training became liability rather than asset. Federal doctrine emphasized maintaining communication, following established procedures, and trusting in equipment that might malfunction under conditions their training had never anticipated. Tommy Morrison returned to the Stump House at sunset on October 16th, carrying intelligence that confirmed Zeke's strategic assessment of the approaching federal operation. Zeke, they're planning to surround the ridge at dawn, establish communication posts at 3 positions, and assault the Stump House directly through the main approach. Kellerman thinks he's conducting a simple arrest operation against a lone criminal. Zeke studied the tactical maps spread across his kitchen table, noting every position where federal agents would be vulnerable to opponents who understood the terrain better than any government manual could teach. "Tommy, what kind of equipment are they bringing?" "Military surplus from the war, communication gear that worked fine in France but might not work so good in these hollows, and enough confidence to make them careless about watching their backs." The information painted a picture of federal preparation that was both formidable and fundamentally flawed. Kellerman's team possessed superior firepower and professional training, but they were planning to fight according to rules that assumed their opponents would behave like conventional criminals rather than mountain families defending traditional territory. Zeke's radio network came alive with reports from observers positioned throughout the federal agents' staging area. Local families who worked in Charleston hotels, restaurants, and government buildings provided real-time intelligence about federal movements, conversations, and preparations that revealed exactly how Kellerman planned to conduct his operation. "Zeke," came a whispered transmission from Sarah Mills, who cleaned offices in the federal building. "Heard them talking about bringing you back alive to make an example for other mountain communities. They want to parade you through Charleston in chains to show that federal authority reaches everywhere." The intelligence confirmed that the approaching operation was about more than arresting a highway robber. Kellerman intended to use Zeke's capture as a demonstration of federal power, designed to intimidate mountain communities that had operated independently for generations. The raid on Devil's Canyon would either break the spirit of Appalachian resistance or escalate the conflict beyond anything federal authorities were prepared to handle. As midnight approached, Zeke made his final preparations for a battle that would either preserve mountain independence or mark its end under federal control. He checked weapons that had belonged to his father and grandfather, men who'd fought government agents during the Civil War and Prohibition. He reviewed escape routes that had been used by Harlan men for 60 years to evade outside authorities. And he accepted that survival might require violence that would make him a legend or get him killed by dawn. The Stump house fell quiet except for the sound of October wind through mountain forests that had sheltered the Harlan family since before federal agents existed to threaten them. But the silence wasn't peaceful, it was preparation. Zeke understood that the approaching federal assault would test everything his family had built, everything his community believed about traditional justice, and everything mountain culture valued about independence from government control. At 3:00 a.m., the first federal vehicles began their approach to Devil's Canyon, following roads that would lead them into terrain controlled by opponents they'd never understood, defended by traditions they'd never respected, and protected by methods they'd never learned to counter. Kellerman's team was confident in their equipment, their training, and their authority, but they were about to discover that some fortresses were too strong to be taken by conventional force. Zeke stood at his window, watching distant headlights wind through valleys that had swallowed government agents before. At 4 feet 3 inches, he'd spent his entire life proving that a man's worth wasn't measured by his physical stature, and tomorrow would either validate that belief or end it permanently. The Mountain Communication Network carried final intelligence about federal positions, federal equipment, and federal plans that revealed exactly how Kellerman intended to destroy everything Zeke had built. But the network also carried something else: the accumulated resolve of families who'd decided that some traditions were worth defending, some territory was worth fighting for, and some authority was too dangerous to accept without resistance. The federal government was about to learn why Devil's Canyon had earned its name, why the tree that swallowed men whole had survived every attempt to destroy it, and why little Zeke Harlan had built a reputation that couldn't be measured in inches but could be calculated in the price federal agents would pay for underestimating mountain justice. Dawn was approaching, bringing with it the most dangerous test of Appalachian independence since the Civil War. Kellerman's federal agents believed they were conducting a simple arrest operation, but they were actually launching an assault on traditions older than their authority, defended by people more determined than their training had prepared them to face, and protected by terrain that had been killing outsiders since before America existed as a unified nation. The tree that had sheltered the Harlan family for 2 generations was about to become the focal point of a war between federal law and mountain justice, between government agents who believed in the power of their badges and a community that understood survival sometimes required resistance that civilized authorities preferred not to acknowledge. The pre-dawn darkness of October 17, 1924, settled over Devil's Canyon like a funeral shroud, thick with mountain mist that would soon carry the smoke of battle between federal authority and Appalachian independence. Special Agent Robert Kellerman crouched behind a granite outcrop 600 yards from Zeke's Stump house, studying his objective through military binoculars that had served him well during raids on Kentucky moonshiners and Pennsylvania bootleggers. At 4:47 a.m., everything was proceeding according to federal doctrine for rural enforcement operations. Kellerman's 12 agents had deployed in a textbook formation designed to overwhelm criminal resistance through superior numbers, coordinated movement, and overwhelming firepower. Agent Williams commanded the northern approach with 4 men. Agent Patterson controlled the southern flank with 3 agents, while Kellerman himself led the main assault team of 5 agents up the primary trail that federal intelligence had identified as the only viable route to the fortress. The federal equipment was impressive by any standard. Thompson submachine guns, military surplus rifles, communication gear that had coordinated major operations during the Great War, and enough ammunition to sustain extended combat against any opposition the Appalachian Mountains could provide. Kellerman felt the satisfaction of superior preparation as he watched his teams move into final positions. What Kellerman didn't understand was that Ezekiel Harlan had been watching federal preparations through a network of observers that extended throughout 3 counties, tracking every movement, timing every deployment, and identifying every weakness in tactical planning that assumed mountain criminals would behave like conventional opponents. Inside the hollow oak that had become his fortress, Zeke stood at a carved window that provided perfect observation of the federal assault while remaining invisible to agents who were approaching, according to routes he'd anticipated for 8 years. At 4 feet 3 inches, his compact frame was perfectly suited for moving through the custom-modified interior of his stronghold, where every passage, every firing position, and every escape route had been designed to maximize his advantages while negating federal superiority in numbers and equipment. "Tommy," Zeke whispered into his radio, speaking to the 19-year-old observer positioned in the tree stand 400 yards above Kellerman's main force, federal count and positions. 12 agents total, Tommy replied, his voice barely audible even to someone listening for it. 5 coming up the main trail under Big Fella's command, 4 on the north ridge, 3 holding the south approach. They got enough firepower to level half the mountain, but they're moving like city boys who never learned to be quiet in the woods. Zeke smiled grimly, understanding that federal training had created exactly the vulnerabilities that mountain warfare was designed to exploit. Kellerman's agents were following established procedures that emphasized coordination, communication, and overwhelming force. But they had no experience dealing with opponents who could use terrain, timing, and tactical intelligence to turn federal advantages into fatal disadvantages. The mountain communication network crackled with final intelligence as Zeke's supporters reported federal positions from concealed observation posts that ringed the entire canyon. Dale Morrison's gravelly voice provided tactical assessment that combined 2 decades of military experience with lifetime knowledge of mountain warfare. Zeke, these boys are bunched up like tourists following a guide. Hit them hard at the choke points, and half their firepower becomes useless. But Zeke's defensive strategy was more sophisticated than simple ambush tactics. 8 years of highway operations had taught him that victory wasn't just about winning battles. It was about sending messages that would discourage future federal interference with mountain communities that valued independence over government protection. Kellerman's raid needed to fail so completely that federal authorities would understand the true cost of challenging Appalachian traditions. At 5:12 a.m., the first phase of the battle began when Agent Patterson's southern team triggered the defensive modifications that Zeke had spent months preparing for exactly this kind of assault. What appeared to be a natural game trail suddenly became a killing zone when carefully positioned deadfalls created obstacles that channeled federal agents into predetermined firing positions while eliminating their tactical mobility. Patterson's radioed warning to Kellerman carried the strain of someone discovering that his professional training was inadequate for the situation he faced. Command, southern approach compromised. Trail blocked by fallen trees that looked deliberately positioned. We're taking rifle fire from concealed positions that we can't identify or return effectively. Kellerman felt his first moment of unease as he absorbed intelligence that suggested his operation was facing prepared defenses rather than panicked criminal resistance. Federal doctrine assumed that rural criminals would either flee when confronted by overwhelming force or fight back through desperate measures that superior training could easily counter. Kellerman's agents weren't prepared for opponents who had turned mountain terrain into tactical advantages that federal equipment couldn't neutralize. The northern team's experience was even more devastating. Agent Williams led his 4 men into what appeared to be natural rocky terrain that provided perfect approach routes to the Stump house. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a maze of natural obstacles that had been subtly modified to create confusion, delay, and exposure to defensive fire from positions they couldn't see or effectively target. Williams's radio transmission carried the frustration of someone whose professional confidence was colliding with tactical reality. Command, northern approach is a nightmare. Natural terrain that's been weaponized somehow. We're taking accurate fire from multiple positions, but return fire is ineffective due to concealment and elevation advantages we can't counter. From his position in the Stump house, Zeke coordinated defensive fire with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment his entire adult life. The fortress itself was a marvel of defensive engineering, with firing ports that provided perfect fields of fire while remaining invisible to attackers, ammunition storage that could sustain extended combat, and communication equipment that maintained contact with supporters throughout the surrounding mountains. But Zeke's real advantage wasn't his fortress. It was his understanding of how federal agents thought, planned operations, and responded to tactical situations their training hadn't prepared them to handle. Kellerman's team was experiencing the kind of systematic failure that occurred when professional soldiers faced opponents who understood their methods better than they understood their enemies. As sunrise painted the mountain ridges with autumn colors that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, Kellerman found himself commanding a federal operation that was failing according to every measure that mattered. His southern team was pinned down by accurate rifle fire from positions they couldn't locate. His northern force was trapped in terrain that negated their numerical superiority in tactical training. And his main assault team was discovering that the primary approach to Zeke's fortress was protected by defensive modifications that made conventional assault impossible. Kellerman's radio crackled with reports that painted a picture of tactical disaster more complete than anything he'd experienced during 8 years of federal enforcement. Command, Southern Team requesting immediate support. We have 2 agents wounded by rifle fire from unknown positions. Medical evacuation required immediately. The Northern Team's situation was equally desperate. Command, Northern approach untenable. Defensive positions are too well concealed and too well positioned for effective assault. We need artillery support or complete tactical revision. Iosku? But the most devastating intelligence came from Agent Morrison, Kellerman's communications specialist, who was monitoring federal radio frequencies from the canyon floor. Sir, our communications are being intercepted and possibly compromised. Someone with professional-grade equipment is listening to our tactical coordination and probably feeding intelligence to defensive positions. Kellerman felt the weight of tactical reality settling on his shoulders as he absorbed information that shattered every assumption about what his operation would face. The Ezekiel Harlan case wasn't simple criminal enforcement. It was military-scale combat against opponents who possessed every advantage that terrain, preparation, and community support could provide. At 6:34 a.m., Zeke's voice echoed through Devil's Canyon with amplified clarity that made his location impossible to determine while ensuring that every federal agent could hear his words. Special Agent Kellerman, your operation is failing because you don't understand what you're really fighting. You think you're arresting a highway robber, but you're actually attacking a mountain community that has been defending itself for over a century. The psychological impact of Zeke's announcement was devastating to federal morale that had already been shattered by tactical failures. Kellerman's agents found themselves fighting an opponent who could communicate freely while their own coordination was compromised, who could move through terrain like smoke while they struggled with obstacles that seemed designed to neutralize every advantage federal training provided. You have 2 choices, Zeke continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who controlled every aspect of the tactical situation. Withdraw your forces and acknowledge that federal authority has limitations in communities that value independence over government protection. Or continue this assault and discover why smart people have avoided Devil's Canyon for 30 years. Kellerman's response revealed the fundamental arrogance that had brought 12 federal agents into conflict with opponents they'd never understood. Harlan, you're surrounded by federal agents with superior firepower and professional training. Your only option is surrender, followed by transportation to federal facilities where you'll face justice for crimes against interstate commerce. Zeke's laughter echoed through the canyon with the kind of amusement that mountain people reserved for outsiders who demonstrated complete ignorance of local realities. Agent Kellerman, look around you. Your Southern Team is pinned down by mountain boys who've been hunting these ridges since childhood. Your Northern force is trapped in terrain that's been killing government agents since the Civil War. And your main assault team is about to discover that my fortress has defensive capabilities your federal training never taught you to anticipate. At 7:19 a.m., Zeke demonstrated exactly what those defensive capabilities involved. The Stump House erupted with coordinated fire from positions that federal agents had never identified, utilizing weapons and ammunition that had been accumulated through 8 years of highway operations. But the real shock wasn't the firepower. It was the tactical sophistication that turned federal numerical superiority into tactical liability. Kellerman's main assault team found themselves under accurate fire from multiple directions simultaneously, trapped on exposed trail approaches that provided no cover while offering perfect targets for defenders who could remain concealed and mobile. Agent Bradley Phillips, a 6-year veteran of federal enforcement, fell with a chest wound that would have been instantly fatal if mountain marksmen had been shooting to kill rather than disable. Command! Agent Davis radioed from his position beside the wounded Phillips. Main assault route is completely compromised. We're taking coordinated fire from prepared positions that suggest military-level defensive planning. Request immediate tactical revision or complete withdrawal. But withdrawal was becoming impossible as Kellerman's teams discovered that Zeke's defensive preparations included controlling every escape route from Devil's Canyon. The roads that had brought federal agents to their target area were now blocked by obstacles that appeared natural, but effectively trapped Kellerman's forces in terrain controlled by opponents who could dictate every aspect of continued combat. Agent Patterson's Southern Team made the first attempt at tactical withdrawal, only to discover that their escape route had been blocked by fallen trees that required clearing equipment the federal operation hadn't brought. Command Southern withdrawal route compromised. Natural obstacles prevent vehicle extraction. We're effectively trapped until obstacles can be cleared manually. The northern team's situation was equally desperate, as Agent Williams reported tactical intelligence that confirmed Kellerman's worst fears. Command northern escape routes blocked by rock slides that appear recent but could be natural. However, timing suggests coordinated effort to trap federal forces in predetermined kill zone. By 8:45 a.m., Kellerman understood that his federal operation had walked into a strategic trap more sophisticated than anything rural criminals should have been capable of planning. His 12 agents were scattered across terrain that favored defenders who knew every tactical advantage, facing opponents who had demonstrated military-level coordination while suffering casualties that federal procedures required him to evacuate immediately. But medical evacuation was impossible while Zeke's forces controlled every approach route, and tactical withdrawal was prevented by obstacles that seemed designed to force federal agents into extended combat under conditions that negated every advantage their training provided. Kellerman faced a decision that would either salvage federal authority or escalate the conflict beyond anything his superiors in Washington were prepared to handle. Agent Harlan, Kellerman radioed toward the Stump house, his voice carrying the strain of someone whose professional confidence had been systematically destroyed. "What are your terms for allowing medical evacuation of wounded federal personnel?" Zeke's response came immediately, carrying the calm authority of someone who had anticipated this moment and prepared accordingly. "Special Agent Kellerman, federal wounded will receive immediate medical attention from mountain people who understand trauma care better than your government doctors." But federal agents leave Devil's Canyon with understanding that some communities cost more to control than any government can afford to pay. The negotiation that followed would be remembered in Appalachian folklore for generations, but it would also establish precedents for federal enforcement that would influence government policy throughout rural America. Kellerman's tactical defeat was complete, but Zeke's strategic victory required demonstrating that mountain justice could be both devastating and merciful, both protective of community traditions and respectful of human life. As federal agents began their humiliating withdrawal from terrain they'd never controlled, carrying wounded comrades and equipment that had proven useless against opponents who fought according to rules no government manual had ever taught, one truth became clear. The tree that swallowed men whole had defended itself successfully against the greatest challenge it had ever faced. But the real test of Zeke's victory would come in Washington, where federal officials would decide whether the Appalachian Mountains represented territory that was too expensive to control, or whether Kellerman's defeat justified escalating federal enforcement to levels that would either break mountain resistance permanently or turn the entire region into a battlefield that neither side could afford to win. The smoke of battle still hung heavy over Devil's Canyon 3 days after the federal retreat, but the echoes of Kellerman's humiliation had already reached Washington, D.C., where Assistant Secretary of Treasury William Bradford sat in his mahogany-paneled office, reading field reports that challenged everything federal authorities believed about law enforcement in rural America. The Harlan incident represented more than tactical failure. It represented a fundamental threat to federal supremacy that could not be allowed to stand without consequences that would reshape the relationship between government power and Appalachian independence. Bradford was not a man accustomed to accepting defeat from mountain communities that dared to resist federal authority. At 45, he'd built his career by expanding federal control into regions that had previously operated beyond government oversight, and he viewed Ezekiel Harlan's victory as a direct challenge to the principle that federal law superseded local tradition regardless of community resistance or tactical complications. "Gentlemen," Bradford announced to the emergency meeting he'd convened with senior federal enforcement officials, "we have a situation in West Virginia that threatens the fundamental authority of the United States government. A criminal dwarf operating out of a tree stump has defeated a federal operation, wounded federal agents, and demonstrated that some communities believe themselves exempt from federal law." The conference room fell silent as Bradford's words sank in among officials who understood that the Harlan case had implications extending far beyond highway robbery in Appalachian mountains. If word spread that federal agents could be defeated by mountain communities defending traditional territory, similar resistance might emerge throughout rural America where federal authority competed with local customs that predated government oversight. But 300 miles from Washington, in the hollow tree that had become a symbol of successful resistance to federal intrusion, Ezekiel Harlan was discovering that military victory created political challenges that might prove more dangerous than the original federal assault. Zeke's defeat of Kellerman's raid had established his reputation throughout Appalachian America, but it had also marked him as a threat that federal authorities could not ignore, without appearing weak to other communities that might be considering their own resistance to government control. The mountain communication network that had coordinated Zeke's defense was now carrying intelligence about federal preparations that suggested Washington's response would escalate far beyond simple law enforcement. Dale Morrison's contacts throughout government agencies reported activities that indicated federal authorities were planning operations designed to make examples of mountain communities that dared to challenge federal supremacy. Zeke. Dale's voice crackled over the radio network that connected mountain families throughout 3 counties. Washington boys are talking about military intervention, not law enforcement. They're considering bringing in National Guard units with artillery support and air reconnaissance. This ain't about arresting a highway robber anymore. This is about whether the federal government can tolerate independent communities that don't bow to federal authority. Zeke received this intelligence while standing at the carved window of his stump house, looking out over the canyon where federal agents had learned that mountain justice could defeat government authority when community traditions were worth defending through whatever violence was necessary. At 28, he'd built something more valuable than a criminal enterprise. He'd created a symbol of successful resistance that inspired mountain families throughout Appalachian America. But symbols could become targets, and Zeke understood that his victory over Kellerman's federal raid had transformed him from a regional outlaw into a national threat that Washington could not allow to survive without destroying federal credibility throughout rural America. The tree that had sheltered his family for 2 generations might not be able to protect him from the full power of federal determination, backed by military resources that no mountain community could hope to resist. Tommy Morrison climbed the hidden trail to the stump house carrying newspapers from Charleston Beckley and as far away as Pittsburgh that painted conflicting pictures of the federal raid's outcome. Some papers described Zeke as a dangerous criminal who had ambushed federal agents conducting legitimate law enforcement. Others portrayed him as a folk hero defending traditional mountain life against government intrusion that threatened community independence. Zeke, Tommy said as he spread the newspapers across the kitchen table. You're famous from Virginia to Ohio, but famous ain't necessarily safe. Government's got to respond to this, and their response is going to be designed to make sure no other mountain community gets ideas about resisting federal authority. Zeke studied the newspaper accounts with the careful attention of someone who understood that public opinion could be as dangerous as government firepower. The stories that portrayed him as a folk hero defending mountain traditions would inspire other communities to consider their own resistance to federal intrusion. But those same stories would convince federal authorities that the Harlan case required responses that would deter similar challenges to government supremacy. The radio network crackled with reports from observers throughout the region who were monitoring federal preparations that suggested Washington's escalation would involve resources far exceeding anything rural communities could resist. Military contractors were moving equipment toward staging areas in Virginia and Kentucky. National Guard units were receiving orders for deployment to unspecified locations in Appalachian territory. And federal agencies were coordinating operations that would either break mountain resistance permanently or turn the entire region into a battlefield. But the intelligence network also carried something else. Reports of community support that extended far beyond Zeke's immediate territory. Mountain families throughout West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia were expressing solidarity with the Harlan defense, offering assistance that ranged from material support to tactical coordination. The federal assault on Devil's Canyon had awakened something that government officials hadn't anticipated. Region-wide resistance to federal authority that viewed Zeke's victory as proof that mountain communities could still defend their traditional independence. Dale, Zeke radioed to his chief intelligence coordinator, "What kind of community response are we looking at if federal escalation targets more than just our operation?" Morrison's answer carried the weight of intelligence gathered from contacts throughout Appalachian America. Zeke, mountain families from Virginia to Tennessee are talking about coordinated resistance if Washington decides to make an example of you. They understand that if federal authority can destroy the Harlan operation through military force, no mountain community is safe from government control that doesn't respect traditional ways of life. The information painted a picture of potential conflict that exceeded anything federal authorities had anticipated when they'd planned Kellerman's simple arrest operation. What had begun as routine law enforcement against a highway robber was evolving into regional resistance that could challenge federal authority throughout rural America, where government control competed with local traditions that valued independence over federal protection. As November approached Devil's Canyon with the first hints of winter that would make military operations more difficult but also limit Zeke's mobility and tactical options, he faced decisions that would determine whether his victory over federal authority could be sustained, or whether Washington's escalation would end mountain independence permanently. The Stump House had never been designed to withstand military assault by National Guard units, with artillery support and air reconnaissance. But Zeke's real fortress wasn't the hollow tree. It was the community network that had sustained his operation for 8 years and had mobilized to defend traditions that were older than federal authority and more valuable than personal safety. On November 3, 1924, the decision that would determine everything arrived through channels that federal intelligence hadn't anticipated and couldn't intercept. A delegation of mountain leaders from throughout Appalachian America climbed the hidden trail to Zeke's fortress, carrying proposals that would either escalate the conflict beyond anything either side could control, or establish precedents that would preserve mountain independence through negotiated settlement rather than continued warfare. Elder Samuel Boone, whose family had been defending mountain territory since Daniel Boone's time, spoke for communities throughout the region when he offered Zeke alternatives that no federal authority had considered. "Son, you've proven that mountain families can still defend themselves against government intrusion. But proving a point ain't the same as winning a war, and Washington's preparing for war that could destroy everything our families have built over 2 centuries." The delegation carried intelligence about federal military preparations that confirmed Zeke's worst fears about escalation. National Guard units were positioning for operations designed to overwhelm mountain resistance through firepower that no community defense could withstand. Federal authorities had decided that the Harlan case required responses that would deter similar challenges to government authority throughout rural America. But they're also scared, continued Rebecca Morrison, whose husband Dale had coordinated intelligence gathering throughout the crisis. Federal officials understand that military action against mountain communities could create martyrs that inspire resistance throughout rural America. They want to end this without creating symbols that threaten federal authority more than your current operation does. The delegation's proposal was elegant in its simplicity and sophisticated in its political understanding. Zeke would voluntarily relocate beyond federal jurisdiction, taking his knowledge and reputation to territories where government authority was even more limited than in the Appalachian Mountains. In exchange, federal authorities would acknowledge that some communities possessed traditional rights that predated federal oversight and deserved respect rather than military suppression. "Where would I go?" Zeke asked, understanding that exile might be the only alternative to destruction that preserved both his life and the principles his resistance had represented. Elder Boone's answer carried the weight of intelligence gathered from contacts throughout territories where federal authority remained theoretical rather than practical. Alaska territories got communities that need protection from government intrusion and corporate exploitation. Places where a man with your reputation and capabilities could build something even more valuable than what you've created here. The proposal offered Zeke everything he'd fought for: the opportunity to continue defending traditional communities against outside authority, the chance to build something larger than a regional operation, and the possibility of establishing precedents that would protect mountain independence throughout rural America. But it also required abandoning the fortress that had sheltered his family for generations, and the community that had supported his resistance for 8 years. As winter settled over Devil's Canyon with snow that would make federal military operations impossible until spring, Zeke faced the final decision of his war against government authority. The tree that had swallowed men whole had protected him through the greatest challenge it had ever faced, but continued resistance might destroy not just his operation, but the entire network of communities that had trusted his leadership. On December 15, 1924, Ezekiel Harlan walked out of his stump house for the final time, carrying weapons that had belonged to his grandfather and plans that would establish his legend throughout territories where federal authority remained weak enough for determined men to carve out independence that government power couldn't eliminate. The hollow oak would stand empty for the first time in 40 years, but it would remain a symbol of successful resistance that inspired mountain families for generations. Federal authorities would declare victory over Appalachian lawlessness, but they would also acknowledge limitations to their power that preserved traditional community rights throughout rural America. Years later, Travelers through Devil's Canyon would tell stories about the deadliest outlaw who'd hunted from his tree tomb, defending mountain justice against federal intrusion until strategic wisdom convinced him to carry his fight to territories where government authority remained weak enough for traditional resistance to flourish. The legend of little Zeke Harlan would grow in the telling. But the principles he'd defended, community independence, traditional justice, and resistance to authority that didn't respect local customs, would continue protecting mountain families long after the man himself had disappeared into territories where determined men could still build empires beyond federal reach. The tree that had swallowed federal agents whole remained standing as a monument to successful resistance, while its former occupant carried his reputation toward frontiers where the battle between government control and community independence continued under different names, but with the same fundamental stakes. Whether some men would bow to authority they'd never accepted, or whether traditional America retained spaces where determination mattered more than federal law,